Aleppo for coming and being with us. It's wonderful to have you. My name is Sister Maria Simperman. I'm a religious of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and a theologian, and serve here at UISG, the International Union of Superiors General, as the Synodality Coordinator. And so we're delighted on behalf of all of us at UISG, we are delighted to have you here for a new series that this is the first session of. And it's on discernment and communal discernment through different charisms and learning from one another. So this actually has come from a real need that was spoken of at the Synod on Synodality that was about how to be a church on mission. And one of the things, and I was blessed to be at the Synod and serving as a theologian and facilitator. And in some ways, it was truly a school of discernment that we were all at. Women, men, laypersons, married, single, religious, bishops, all learning together how to discern and listen to the Spirit about how are we to be a church on mission that lives communion, participation, and pulls it all forth through mission everywhere. And so one of the things that came from the final document of the Synod, and we really are encouraging everyone to read it, it's only 155 paragraphs. And it's really yet another movement that flows out of Vatican Council II, particularly Lumen Gentium and the chapter on the church as the people of God. Well, in this, in our discussions, was a need for greater participation of all people and building communion for the sake of God's mission. And that time is going to need two things. One is spiritual renewal, and second, reform of structures where they're needed. If you're Franciscan, Francis knew that very well, repair my church. But in general, this was a movement that flows again from the early church, the Acts of the Apostles as well, but through Vatican II and now to this moment that we are in, which is a beautiful moment in our church and for the whole people of God. One of the calls that came from this was really to bring to the local churches more experiences of discernment and communal discernment in particular. We can discern personally, but how do we together as a parish, as a school community, as religious communities, how do we discern? And we do it communally. And the movement then was a real call to say, how can we do this? And how can we bring the riches of our church tradition to this? And as you may know, one of the paths we've been walking is by using a method of conversation in the Spirit. And it's a way of, in circles often, to each speak what they have heard and to together say, what are we hearing? And by the way, we do quarterly trainings for this. We just did one a few weeks ago in September, and they're open to everyone. Once a year, we do a session that is conversation in the Spirit for leadership teams of any kind, general councils, provincial councils, and also formation teams. And so we go very specifically on how you can use this. But really, Pope Francis and now Pope Leo has asked the entire church to learn this method as a way of dialogue, as a way of listening to the Word, to the Spirit, to one another, and also a movement towards discernment. And what happened there was we did use some of the wisdom that has come from the Ignatian tradition of uh, spiritual conversation. And yet, one of the early conversations before the synod even happened was other charisms started saying, but we have a way too, and there's not only one way. And in religious life, we know that the Spirit is so creative that we have so many charisms, so many gifts of the Spirit given to serve the church and the world. So I know some of you here are Franciscans, but there's also Sacred Heart. There's also St. Joseph of Cluny. There's also Holy Cross. There's so many different communities here. And so the wisdom was to realize that we really can benefit, all of us, from learning more about communal discernment through different charisms. And even with conversation in the spirit, one of the conversations with our Jesuit friends was, well, yes, conversation in the spirit has an Ignatian lens to it. However, um, conversation in the spirit asks for very deep listening. And perhaps the Benedictines, who have as the first word of their rule, listen, can teach us something about how to listen. And the Cistercians, who have a lot to teach us about silence, maybe can help us because between each person speaking and between round 1 and 2 and 3, we're asking for more silence. So maybe we have something to learn there. And there are times when we can find ourselves each sharing different perspectives. And we say, but we still are tugging, where there's still tensions here. How can we walk with these? And here, somebody said, well, the Dominicans might be able to offer something because they use the word disputatio, right? And so it was recognizing then in each of our ways of doing discernment, there are many ways we need one another. And so the gift has been the insight to say, why don't we do a series where we can learn from one another about communal discernment, right? And so in our local churches and our local parishes, but also in our own communities. If you're Franciscans, I hope there's something you'll learn here too. But how can we, what's the richness of discernment as we look at it through the different glasses, the different diamond edges of charisms? And so we are beginning today actually with the Franciscan method. And we have with us someone with great expertise. But and before I introduce him, I want to make sure those of you who are just coming on that you are able to push the language button. There are directions coming up here on how to do it. Also in the chat to look at the language button in English or the little round globe, and to click on that and to click on the language of your choice. So English, Spanish, French, Italian. So if you would do that, because that will be very helpful, especially as we have discussion and as we will be have opportunities later to go into some discussion groups. So it's very helpful if you could do this. And here again in the chat are some directions for this. And I again welcome you and invited people to write where are you coming from today? And so I'm here in Rome and happy to welcome you, about a 10-minute walk from St. Peter's. And we have people from the United States, Pennsylvania. They're waking up early, I can see. South Australia, that's going to be a little late. We have people from Sri Lanka, from Philippines, from Illinois, somebody coming in from Belgium, Malaysia. I keep looking through here. We have quite a bit from Milan and in the north, in Lyon. Bangladesh is with us, España, gracias, Chicago, uh, Wisconsin, all over. We have people from Honduras and Central America. We're looking Maribor, Slovenia. So Slovenia is my home country. We're looking through so many places. So thank you. Sao Paulo, Brazil. So the people in the Americas, this is early for them. So thank you. And those of you in Asia, it's late. Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, bienvenidos. All over. So it's just beautiful. Trinidad, Tobago, Romania, Papua New Guinea. So we're just blessed. Kenya. So you are welcome. This is the global community that is the church and that is consecrated life, but also all those who are connected in faith and in looking at things through a faith tradition. So as we begin today, I just want to offer a little introduction of our speaker, our presenter, who will then be presenting in two to three different parts, and we will have conversation in between as well. But we have with us a friend here, Father Thomas Nairn, a Franciscan, who entered the Franciscan order in 1968. He was ordained a priest in 1975. He earned his master's degree of divinity and his MA in arts in theology from the same place that Pope Leo studied, and it's Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where I'm also a faculty member. And his doctoral degree is in Christian theology with the specialization in Christian ethics. He taught for 18 years at Catholic Theological Union until he became the senior director of ethics and theology at the Catholic Health Association of the United States. And he was in that position for almost 10 years until he became the provincial minister of the Sacred Heart Province in the United States in 2017. And he served there until 2023 when the six US provinces joined together. We understand that, joined together to become the province of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And he is currently the director of initial formation at St. Joseph Friary in Chicago, walking distance from CTU. And he's written books, articles, popular and professional, and in many areas. And here I want to just notice, particularly looking at the Franciscan moral vision. And so we're delighted. When I was looking at for people with expertise in these different topics, I was looking who can do Franciscan communal discernment, with bringing in the richness of this. And it took some months of exploring and asking. And then again and again, it was Father Tom Nairn, Father Tom Nairn. And so, Tom, it's a delight to have you here with us. You are most welcome, and we will let you begin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria. I'm happy to be with all of you. Looking out, I see a few even familiar faces that I was not expecting, but it's so interesting to have people from halfway around the world here, and also from one sister who lives right next door to me here, Sister Karina Thomas. So very happy to be with you, and you will now see how much of a Luddite I am as I try to share the screen. theologian, I am terrible at technology, which might be some of yours, you sisters' experience as well. But I'm very happy to be with you. And what I would like to do today is to basically begin with the prayer that was attributed to St. Francis as he was discerning his call from God. The Franciscans realized this, but other sisters might not. Francis, as a young man, was basically a playboy. He sort of was a led a rather dissipated life and wanted to be a knight. And fighting the next town, Perugia, he ended up as basically a prisoner of war for a year. As he returned, what he had done before seemed not to have any meaning for him at all. And he continued to pray either in caves or in rundown churches outside of Assisi. And one especially, the Church of San Damiano, which if anybody's been to Assisi, it is halfway down the hill that Assisi is built on, and prayed before this crucifix in a very church which was itself being only partly a church since it had been pretty well destroyed for lack of use. But in front of that crucifix, he kept praying this prayer. And I tend to think it's a very helpful prayer as we try to understand what discernment might be. So as he prayed, let us pray. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart. Give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. And I tend to think that prayer already tells us something about what Franciscan discernment in the Franciscan family might mean. It is a prayer to be enlightened, but not only in the mind, not only in the head, but maybe especially in the heart. And what is the purpose of discernment? Not to carry out my will, not to get others to convinced that I know what we ought to be doing, but that we together may carry out the holy and true command of God. So, what is discernment? As Maria has said, um, different communities see discernment in different ways. And oftentimes, what we're dealing with in discernment is the what of discernment, those major issues that affect us as religious communities, us as parishes, us as the church, and asking, Lord, what is your will? When I was in the Catholic Health Association, we had two ideas of decision making. One were the small things that had to be done, and those could be dealt with rather easy, and there were decision guides for that. But the major questions that health systems were facing needed more time, more silence, etc. So we developed not only decision guides, but also discernment guides. And those guides were very helpful because they gave us the how of discernment. What I tend to think the Franciscan school is trying to do is also ask us the why of discernment. Uh, what issues need discerning? How do we do that? But also, why is discernment possible? And as Maria has already suggested, discernment is not what I want to do. Discernment is not what I feel needs to be done. But it's always asking the question, what might God be leading us to in this area? And how do I know that? It takes more, I think, than simply a process. It is what we bring to that process that becomes important. And so what we will be doing is taking a look at a bit of the why, but more especially the how. I mean, a bit of the what, and more especially the how, and very much especially why are we discernment? Why is discernment possible? So, with that in mind, what I'd like to suggest is if we take a look at religious traditions in the church, synodality and discernment have been part and parcel of what we have been as religious through our whole experience. Um, Forms of synodality and discernment go back to the early church. Think even Acts of the Apostles, the Council of Jerusalem, where Paul is asking the church to make a very important decision. Do Gentiles need to become Jewish before they can become Christian? And there were quite different opinions in that early synod, quite different understandings, not only of the head, but especially the heart. For all, this was a life and death decision. It was what it meant to be church, what it meant to be those who are followers and disciples of Christ. Must that be a Jewish understanding? And it was the result of that discernment, that element of synodality, that set the direction of the church now for 2,000 years. From the Middle Ages, this understanding of synodality and discernment was basically carried out by religious orders. With the Benedictine tradition, as Maria suggested, the notion of Lectio Divina, to constantly read over Scripture time and time again, to repeat it, to repeat it, to repeat it, and to ask what God might be calling us to be and to do throughout the Scripture. Chapters, a medieval form of synodality, very prominent. Not only religious chapters, in my tradition, we speak always of still of 1221, where Francis had a chapter on the plains below Assisi, in which 4,000 of his followers, just think, 10 years after, less than 10, just about 10 years after he began the order, 4,000 friars from around the world met in Assisi as they needed to sleep on mats outside. It became what we call the chapter of Mass. 4,000 friars together without the aid of Zoom or microphones, worked together, prayed together to communally discern what God might be calling them to do. For religious communities, all of our actions, not all, but our important actions are usually the result of some synodal or communal discernment. And so we're not speaking about something new. We're speaking about really going back to the early church. We're going back to what our religious communities have oftentimes, and for some of us always done, as we discern what God is calling us and where God is calling us. And we have, I think, interestingly, two popes, one after the other, who were from religious orders. And so it's not unusual that Pope Francis begins his pontificate with discernment, with an understanding of synodality. And it's not unusual that when Pope Leo uh, became Pope, as Maria says, the Pope who graduated from the school that both Maria and I taught at, uh, we understand that synodality continues. In its very first address on the balcony of St. Peter's, the day he was elected, he said to the world, "To all of you brothers and sisters of Rome, of Italy, of all the world, we want to be a synodal church. Um, Synodality is not going to go away with the death of Pope Francis. But what did he mean by synodality, and what might be a Franciscan tweak on that synodality? For Francis, Francis liked to speak about missionary discernment. And he spoke, and this was in his writings, but also in the documents of the papacy, would always speak about three moments. In his book, Let Us Dream, A Path to a Better Future, he labeled these moments as a time to see, a time to choose, and a time to act. If you have any understanding of the Franciscan ethical tradition, social ethical tradition from the late 1800s on, you know that see, judge, act is a very sacred understanding within the church. It goes back actually to the very early 20th century by Joseph Cardine, who ultimately became Cardinal Joseph Cardine, Cardine, I think, sorry, um, developed with the Young Christian Workers, which became Catholic Action, and basically served as the model for Catholic social teaching. See, judge, act. It was with Pope John the 23rd in his encyclical Mater et Magistra that see, judge, act enters the papal lexicon. Uh, in his encyclical Mater et Magistra, uh, he said, teachings in regard to social matters are put into effect in three stages, expressed in three words: observe, judge, act. See, judge, act. Observe, judge, act. This has been a wonderful help for the church in the past 100 years. But I tend to think that there might be some possible difficulties with our see, judge, act paradigm. Uh, there are limits to what that might mean. And in 2021, uh, we Franciscans of the First Order, OFMs, had our general chapter in Rome. It was supposed to be in the Philippines for you sisters in the Philippines. Unfortunately, 2021 was still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we had to change things rather quickly and moved the chapter to Rome. Interestingly, all of our Franciscan houses could not uh, accommodate us. And so for the first time, the OFM general chapter was in the Capuchin College in Rome, halfway between the city and the airport. And it was at that time that I was asked to give a homily on one of the days. And the gospel at that time was the brothers picking grain, the disciples of Jesus picking grain, and the Pharisees looking at Jesus and saying, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. And as I was dealing with the See, Judge, Act, and already realizing where the Franciscan movement had been, which I will see in a moment, began realizing that See, Judge, Act can be blinded by a sense of individualism, can be blinded by a sense of entitlement. Notice the Pharisees see what the disciples are doing. They judge it to be against the law, and they act telling Jesus that his disciples are doing what is wrong, they are in fact sinning. Jesus' response, don't you know that when uh, David needed to uh, have food for his people, he went into the temple and took the loaves that only the priests are to eat. We can be blinded by our sense of way things ought to be done, the way things we've always done. See, judge, act is hallowed within the Catholic tradition. See, judge, act is the way we have done things for over 100 years. But the question is, might that be tweaked a little bit? And it was, for those of you sisters in Kenya, it was in our uh, plenary council meeting in Kenya that occurred in 2018 that the brothers began asking the question, can there be another way of looking at this? Can there be another way of understanding what discernment might mean? First of all, that meeting was fascinating in the sense that rather than being in language groups, which we have done since time immemorial, we chose what they called the World Cafe system, where brothers of different languages, different countries, etc., were forced on the same table together. The meetings went slower because we were not simply in our own language groups. People had to listen more carefully to one another. Oftentimes, somebody had to translate for another friar to get his point across, but it slowed things down and it forced us to listen in ways we have never done before. It is, Maria mentioned the word listening. You're going to see in our Franciscan tradition how important listening to the other is. And so the outcome of that plenary council, which we have been dealing with for the past 7 years, and honestly, before that, was moving from see, judge, act to listen, discern, go forth. See, judge, act can be individualistic. Listen, discern, go forth cannot be. If we begin with listening, if listening is part of what we are about, then, as Maria said, uh, things change. Our concentration needs to be on the other. I'll say a little bit more about that as we move uh, into our next phase. And so what is going to happen today and tomorrow is I'm going to try to understand what it might mean for us as, well, for me as a Franciscan, for us as religious, for us as church, to truly listen to one another, to discern together, and to allow that discernment process to move us forward as we go forth. See, judge, act, listen, discern, go forth. I'm not saying that see, judge, act is wrong. I'm saying that listen, discern, go forth might help us gain a bit more insight into what the church has understood within its social ethics tradition as see, judge, act. And so for us male friars, listen, discern, go forth, we're using sort of a hearing metaphor to listen to the other, to allow ourselves, to allow the other to be the focus of our hearing. St. Clare of Assisi, in her third and fourth letter to uh, Agnes of Prague. Now, many people, when they hear Agnes, think that that is a letter to Clare's sister, who is also a poor Clare. Agnes of Prague was the daughter of the Bohemian king, a princess in her own right. Uh, Father, the King of Bohemia. Uh, and as the friars moved on foot, there were no fast trains in those days, throughout all of Europe, and in fact, even into Britain before Francis died. It was the daughter of the King of Bohemia, Agnes, who, by her relationship with the male Franciscans, began a community of Poor Clares as far away from Assisi as uh, Prague in Bohemia. And we have still 4 letters that Clare wrote to Agnes. We have sadly no letters that Agnes wrote to Clare. But in the 3rd and 4th letter, Clare uses the metaphor of a mirror, and we'll be talking about that later. Don't think of the wonderful mirrors we have today. Think of polished bronze. And so what Clare says is that what we need to do, all of us, is look into the mirror and see the cross of Christ. That's why the San Damiano crucifix is here. Normally, when we look into a mirror, we see our face. What we need to see is not us, but Christ crucified. And what she suggests as we look into the mirror is we need to gaze. Gaze is not simply taking a look. Gaze is really concentrating on the other, really putting our entire focus on the other. Gaze is not simply looking. And then she says we need to consider and we need to contemplate. I want to suggest, and we'll say much more about this tomorrow, that the consider, contemplate are part of the discernment element of a Franciscan understanding of discernment. And finally, imitate. For many of the older religious orders, Benedictines, Trappists, Cistercians, etc., contemplate was the highest movement we can be. In fact, contemplation takes us out of this world into God. For Clare, interestingly, contemplate is along the way, and contemplate is that which allows us to truly imitate Christ to our sisters and brothers in the world. So I want to suggest that the earlier understanding, listen, discern, go forth, in Clare's vocabulary could be with the visual notion to gaze, to consider, to contemplate, to imitate. So we're going to talk more about gazing today. We're going to talk about consider, contemplate, imitate tomorrow. And so what I want to suggest, and a good friend of mine here in Chicago, in fact, he just moved to Chicago, is a Jesuit who is now the vice provost at Loyola University. And we both talk about discernment with a big D and discernment with a small d. He, I think, rightly acknowledges that discernment as a process is reserved for the major decisions that I need to make as an individual or we need to make as a community. If I needed to discern every decision in my life, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning because getting out of bed would take a discernment process. And so I agree with my friend that the discernment as a process, which he calls discernment with a capital D, is not an everyday situation. He acknowledges, after we've been talking, that there's a discernment with a small d, and that's an attitude, a discerning attitude. Discernment as a spirituality, discernment as a way of being. The disagreement I have with him is what he calls discernment with a capital D, I call discernment with a small d, and what he calls discernment with a small d, I call discernment with a capital D. I tend to think if we do not have that attitude of discernment, that habitus of discernment, that spirituality of discernment, any of our discernment processes are never going to work. And so, I mean, to me, he and I have this argument about whether D's are uppercase or lowercase. But I tend to think it's important that we understand the reality and the uh, correctness of each of our attitudes. Discernment as a process can't be done for everything. And we need to know when to use and when to not. But discernment as an attitude, discernment as a spirituality, we can never leave. And I tend to think that's part of the Franciscan contribution to this ongoing discussion of synodality and discernment is that we see discernment, not that others don't, but we emphasize discernment as a spirituality. We begin that discerning process. This is back to listen, discern, go forth with attention on the other. Claire's gaze takes the attention from herself and places it on the other. The Franciscan listening takes the attention from myself and puts it on the other. Knowing, seeing can be an individual act. I see things. I can judge, I can discern. It can all be focused on what I am doing. But if we are talking about listening or gazing, the focus has to be on the other. I cannot listen by myself. I need an other to listen to. I can listen to God, but God is the other as well. And therefore, immediately, as we move to the question of listening, as I'll say a little bit more later, we understand that listening is a communal task. Listening puts me in the presence of the other. Say more about that in a bit. We now then move through communal discernment. And as we see about Claire's consider and contemplate, I tend to think there are two movements in there. And I tend to think as we do this communally, some of us are going to be more adept at one or the other. There's the movement to the head, those thinkers in our communities who have the ideas that need to be said. There's also the movement to the heart, the feelers of our communities, the people who have internalized some of these elements. I'm not saying one is more important than the other. I'm saying that as we as a community move into communal discernment, we need both. Finally, we end in action. What action forces us to do is to do something. And so the spirituality involves listening, discerning, and finally imitating. Um, the last point before we break into our conversations, I would just like to say, uh, as we do this, as we enter into this listening, dialoguing moment, we can bring many things to the discernment. And in some situations, these do not allow us to truly discern. Argument, debate. I have got the ideas and I'm going to get you to agree with me. Argument is much more the emotions. You're wrong, I'm right, and I'm going to keep at it until you see that you're wrong and I'm right. Debate is oftentimes more the intellectual thing, but it still is, I've got the answers and I'm going to try to convince you. Dialogue discussion raised the questions of here is my point of view without just uh, dialogue discussion raises the question of here's my point of view, that is yours. oftentimes that's where the discussion ends. Conversation, and one of my professors when I was graduate school was David Tracy. And what David Tracy says is there's a theology of conversation. If I'm truly entering into a conversation, I need to be open to changing my mind. I need to be open to changing my mind. And if I do not accept the possibility that I will change my mind, I will not be in a conversation. If I do not entertain the possibility of changing my mind, I am not in discernment. So conversation is going to be an important word as we can continue. And notice what Pope Francis and what the synodality discussions have always been about. As Maria said earlier, we're talking about conversations in the spirit, not arguments, not debates, not dialogues, not discussions, but conversations in the spirit. And within that, what I would like to do now is return this to Maria as for your first discussion, which will be a group discussion, not individual chat, small groups.
Perfect. Thank you. This has been wonderful, Tom. I'm grateful for all of this and your way of opening us up to look at See, Judge, Act in a different way, and a Franciscan way that would invite us to look at listen, discern, go forth. So if the invitation for the group right now, and this is going to be in the large group, so we're not moving to small groups until later. But the invitation is to look at that question and your own experience. Where in your experience have you found, or maybe not found, a different way than seeing just and then judging and acting? What have you found in light of listening, uh, discerning, and going forth? What's resonating with you? You can write in the chat, or you can raise your hand. On the bottom are little markers there for reacting and offering something. But what we've been listening to Tom talk to us about the importance of listening, and that's the first step, and that when we're doing any kind of discernment, the listening invites us to look outside and to hear outside ourselves. So whether you're a Franciscan or in any spiritual tradition, just a minute of silence with this, and then I'll invite people to write in the chat. What are your thoughts on what Tom has just said? What's your thinking? uh, in reframing here. Does this resonate with the Franciscans or others? But we'll take just 1 minute of silence to sit with what you've heard, and then I'll invite sharing. Some words that go with active listening: suspending judgment, intentional speaking, acting with love. From Rose, that it enriches the process when we go from me, just my seeing or my judging, to the we. Somebody saying, I hadn't thought about this really being individualistic when it's See, Judge, Act. Arlene is offering the quality of listening can be compromised when we have a lot of noise, cultural noise. Sue is saying that C. Judge Act always seemed like a more colder, cerebral uh, act, and yet our founders' experience has been to break open the deeper meanings, keep telling the founding stories. And the large D and the small d are enlightening it. And we're going to offer a couple more comments, Tom, and then if you want to respond to any of these in a moment. And she says, I was wondering what words for other traditions would describe the small d. So that's maybe a question for those of you who are in other traditions, other charisms. The We have here, I find that framing synodality by listening discernment going forth provides a space not only of listening to one another, but more so giving space for the Spirit to speak through us. It's a new learning to be open to the new versus dialogue and debate. So the sense of conversation changes things as well. And focus on the other with listening, and that to see allows you to evaluate and then take action. Um, and we have our interpreters are going to offer a better pronunciation than I'm going to offer of the different languages. So I think Sylvia, I think could you read some of the Italian here from Maria Clara e uh, uh, Sister Aneshka? And you'd have to unmute. So this is to our interpreters, Sylvia, and it's at the minute would be at 2:53 from Maria Chiara and Aneshka. Can you read it for us? Please unmute. We can't hear you.
Sister Maria, that's because I'm in the booth. So you can ask towards this kind of discernment.
Unfortunately, we're not always willing to do this kind of listening to one another that leads us to this kind of discernment. Thank you so much. Grazie mille.
Thank you.
So we have just a few more. We have the point about deep listening as an essential component of seeing, and imitating Christ is part of the acting. Um, es correcto que nos vamos a los argumentos, debatimos lo que se dice y no sabemos escuchar. Es abrirme al otro. Me está ayudando mucho el tema. We're gonna keep moving through here. We have so many points here, but a lot here, many here are talking about the importance of listening. Have noted the conversation is a lens to conversion. And Tom, I have to say to you that that's very much part of all the training for conversation in the Spirit, and even at the Synod, that the conversation isn't simply, to hear how was your cappuccino, but the conversation at this level with the bigger D maybe, or maybe the middle-sized letter, for those spaces where you really hear and listen to one another, is that when you have a conversation about, you don't have to discern a major decision, but when you can really hear one another so that you can hear and be changed by the other. I think you're trying to point that to us as this is a way of being in our daily life too. And how do we listen so that what the other says I can be transformed by? And we actually found that at the Synod to be true. So this is, it's beautiful to realize it's the Franciscan, it's within your tradition that also we're learning this, and that you're practicing this. Tom, I don't know if you see some of these comments and you have some further thoughts.
Uh, Certainly, I've tried to look at the chat boxes. I've been impressed by what people have been saying. Listening as associated with prayer, and we'll be talking about that later. Exactly right. Um, I'm not quite sure we can listen to God as the other if we're not listening to our sisters and brothers as others. And so uh, I think that's one point. Uh, a few of the comments that I read were that it allows others to have a voice. And voice, I think, is a very important idea nowadays, when sadly so many do not have a voice. And I tend to think exactly what the spirituality of listening is. Uh, if I am to listen, the other must speak. And oftentimes there are those who are not given a voice. And to the extent, and as we continue this into the discerning process and the going forth process, if we do not hear from everyone, uh, our imitation, our action will be diminished. We, at the beginning of this process, the listening and the quality of listening is going to affect the end of the process, how we go forth and why we go forth. So that's it. Several of you have talked about openness and allowing ourselves to be changed. And if we go, for some reason I can't, there we go. Back to this theology conversation. I don't need to listen in argument and debate. I don't want to be changed. In dialogue and discussion, change may occur, but it's not the most important element. In conversation, I need to take the risk to be changed. I need to take the risk that my idea is at best only a perspective of the truth and at worst wrong. I have to be vulnerable to acknowledging that I might need to change. And I think that's for almost all of us, and maybe for us in the West more especially, that's a difficult thing to acknowledge sometimes, that I'm wrong, or that I need other perspectives to make things better. When I was provincial, one of the things I learned very quickly is we need time for conversation to truly occur. And people need to be free to express themselves, to express their ideas, to express their disagreements. And oftentimes, I don't know if this is true of women's communities, but definitely of men's, oftentimes I would not speak until I heard everybody else, because once the provincial talks, everybody says, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes. Sir. Well, maybe not so much anymore, but it used to be yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. I knew when the Spirit was present in our meetings, when everybody would give their ideas as to what we needed to do, how we needed to go forth. And then we just stopped and maybe wait until the next day. Anyway, have some time to move away and then to come back to the discussion. Ideally, there was prayer involved, but maybe not with all of my brothers was there prayer involved. But oftentimes when we returned to the conversation, we had already moved to a different place that understood the concerns of everyone in that conversation. And we ended up with, I think, a decision that was better than the decision we would have made had the dominant voices been the only ones to speak. And so I tend to think the importance of conversation, the importance of listening, as we'll talk about soon, is allowing ourselves vulnerability, allowing ourselves to trust one another, and allowing ourselves to continue with the conversation until we have an agreement, not necessarily that everybody totally buys in, but everybody could live with. Um, the worst thing I tend to think in religious life are votes. The council's 7 members, 4-3 or 5-4, etc. That's wrong. That's really problematic. Uh, Oftentimes, if we allow ourselves to continue the conversation, if we allow ourselves to keep listening, we might move to a different place. And so, with that, is there anything else that you would like to say, Marie, before we move into the next part?
No, actually, I feel like I feel the Franciscan spirit was truly at the Synod because those were some of the very recognitions. And maybe that says that this is that wider truth of the spirit that comes because there was this need to, one, give time. And I think you're giving us a real great example of that. You have to have enough time for deep conversation and spaces. The other piece, and I'm going to let you go though, but because I think of this always as a deeply Franciscan reminder to us, it's gospel, but definitely Franciscan, is to listen to especially the voices on the peripheries. And Francis, the people made poor were those. And Pope Francis was so keen on making sure we listen to the people from the margins. And so somebody who worked on the boat that caught the people falling off boats or coming across the Mediterranean, who would remind us of refugees and migrants, was one of the members of the Synod. And in the final document, in one of the paragraphs, it says, the people made poor are agents of evangelization to us.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Exactly.
it goes into what you're saying about that listening. So now I'm going to go back and have you continue, and we'll
Excellent.
continue listening because this has been
Just
so
one point,
helpful. Thank you.
yeah, just one point to what you were saying, Maria. Um, those of you who've been in Assisi or in Franciscan houses in Italy, the houses were always outside the city walls. They were not inside the city. And if you know anything about medieval life, the rich were on the top of the hill, the poor were on the bottom of the hill, and the poorest of the poor were outside the protection of the city walls. Francis and the Portiuncula were down in the valley. Clare's monastery, San Damiano, was outside the city walls. Uh, the poor, the unprotected, the vulnerable, which is what that symbolizes. And so this has been part of our tradition, and it's a tradition not only of Franciscans, but of others that really needs to be retrieved by the church today. And so let's move into the listening moment. And again, uh, returning to Clare, I mentioned Agnes of Prague and the 4 letters that Clare wrote to Agnes and that image of the mirror, which we'll be saying much more about later. Uh, I tend to think her discussion in that 4th letter talks about listening and talks about silence. She says to Agnes, may in your love, may the tongue of the flesh be silent, may the tongue of the spirit speak. Um, I just want to begin. We are so oftentimes uh, in love with our own talk. Let the tongue of the flesh be silent. The only way to listen to the other is by being silent. And therefore, listening is a spiritual moment. And so let, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. Banners were every place when I was growing up, especially in churches. And would love to have this banner, may the tongue of the flesh be silent, may the tongue of the spirit speak. Uh, so oftentimes we think that our tongue of the flesh is the tongue of the spirit. And sadly, it might be my spirit but it might not be the Holy Spirit. And so as we move into this second part of today's conversation, let's keep that in the back of our minds. Let the tongue of the flesh be silent. Let the tongue of the Spirit speak. And for those of you who are part of the Franciscan tradition, I hope you read those 4 letters of Clare's to Agnes of Prague. They're so deeply spiritual, and they are so deeply important, I think, today, possibly even more than the time of Clare. So, to gaze is Franciscan listening. And as many of you mentioned, gazing is not simply seeing. Gazing, as you all mentioned, is prayerful. Gazing allows the others to have a voice. Gazing allows me to be changed. And perhaps the image, no, images, sorry, Clare's image was gazing into the mirror and not seeing myself, but seeing the crucified Christ. But perhaps another image today might be 2 people who are in love gazing at each other. Um, it's not looking, it's not seeing, it's not simply intellectual, it's emotional. It involves the whole person. So gazing is not simply with our eyes, gazing is with our whole spirit. And so, what do we need to see? In gazing, our attention is on the other. Our attention is not on myself, on how I feel, on what I'm thinking, on how I know that the other is wrong and how I'm going to correct them. That is not gazing. Gazing, honestly, is my entire attention on the other, whether that's in chapel, in prayer, whether that is 2 lovers looking into one another's eyes. Gazing is my entire being focused, my entire attention focused on the other. But for my entire attention to be focused on the other, I need the other. I cannot gaze on my own. Sadly, we do talk about navel gazing, but that's not what I'm talking about at all. I need the presence of the other, oftentimes the physical presence, but at least the mental and the spiritual presence, so that when the other is absent, I am still attending to that other. I'm still focusing on the other. The other is still present to me in a particular way. So notice other, other. If we're totally listening, that's where our focus is, on the other. But as I said before, if this is the case, there is need for silence. Need for silence, not only the silence of my tongue, but the silence of my heart. There are all sorts of things that can distract me from the other. And oftentimes those things are inside of me. I'm uncomfortable about what somebody is saying, and rather than allowing myself to remain there, I try to rebut. I try to make myself more comfortable. I might stop listening. And therefore, what this spirituality of listening is a demand for my taking attention off of myself and allowing it to be with the other. And there's a vulnerability in that, because back to conversation. If I'm truly attending to the other, if I'm truly allowing the other to be in my presence and me in that person's presence, then I am vulnerable. Why am I vulnerable? Because I have to admit that I might be wrong in my conviction. I have to at least admit the possibility that I will change my mind, that my partial perspective might not be the most important perspective at this time and place. And therefore, what I want to keep suggesting is that there is a spiritual quality of listening. And there's a prayerful element here. Years and years ago, when I was teaching at Catholic Theological Union, I was a spiritual director to a deacon in the archdiocese, a permanent deacon, married man with two children, a son and a daughter, both adults. So this man was relatively, I mean, he was probably in his 40s or 50s at that time. And as we were engaged in spiritual direction, he kept saying that he was not getting anything out of prayer, that somehow he prayed and he prayed and he prayed and he prayed, but he never got the impression that God was answering him, that God was hearing him, that God was listening to him. Later on in the same spiritual direction, he began talking about his family, and especially his daughter, that he was having some difficulties with. And at one point he says, my daughter talks and talks and talks and talks. She never listens. I can't get a word in edgewise. And I says, aha, let's go back to the discussion of prayer. You say you keep praying and praying and praying and praying. Are you your daughter? Are you talking and talking and talking and talking and not listening? And can God get a word in edgewise? The need for silence. Because to me, silence is the most important part of prayer and the important part of Franciscan discerning. It is in the silence of my heart that I will begin to hear the voice of God. Remember our opening prayer. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart. Give me certain hope, of true faith, certain hope, perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. It is only in silence that I could allow God and others to enlighten the darkness of my heart. And so, again, listening, gazing, and I use those two metaphors almost interchangeably, demands silence. And I tend to think in that silence is the spiritual quality of listening. If we honestly believe that prayer, now when I was a kid in grade school, we had in the United States what was called the Baltimore Catechism. It shows you how old I am. This was a question and answer catechism that we learned from first grade on through high school. And you kept getting the same questions and you kept getting pretty well the same answers. Who is God? God is the creator of heaven and earth and of all things. See, this happened 60 years ago and I still remember the answers right away. But what was prayer? Prayer is talking to God. As an old man now, I say that is the stupidest definition of prayer there is. Prayer is not talking to God. Prayer is listening to God. Prayer is in the silence of my heart, trying to hear what God is saying, in the silence of my heart, trying to hear what the other is telling me. That, to me, is the spiritual quality of listening. And if I allow that silence, if I allow myself to truly listen to the other, that's when I grow in the Franciscan life for me, grow in my spiritual life, grow in my awareness of others, grow in the understanding that while I do have answers, while I do have things that are important, so do others. My understanding is a partial understanding. My conversation, my speaking is a partial speaking. And to get the entire whole, I need the other. And in doing that, I learn more and more who God is. We Franciscans believe that the prayer of Francis, which he says over and over and over again, is, "Who are you, O God, and who am I? Who are you, O God, and who am I?" And I can only understand who I am as a servant of God by being with and listening to my sisters and brothers who are also servants of God, who also have something important to say. So Franciscan listening, gazing, whether we want the hearing metaphor of listening, whether we want the visual metaphor of gazing, attention needs to be off of me and onto the other. Listening, therefore, allows the other to be the center of my attention. It allows me to reconnect to them, or oftentimes to connect for the first time to them, to begin to understand not only their thoughts, but their concerns, their questions, their uncomfortability, which may or may not be my uncomfortability. And as I learn to reconnect to others, I learn to reconnect to God. And therefore, this silent awareness, which I believe is the spirituality of listening, is truly a contemplative moment. There are all sorts of definitions of contemplation, and mine is a very simple and possibly even a simplistic one. To be a contemplative is to be silently aware. To be a contemplative is to be silently aware. And I honestly believe that this spiritual listening, this silent awareness, can invoke awe and trust. This has happened to me so many times when I'm with the other. In fact, one of my jobs now is being on a board of trustees, a board of directors of one of our Franciscan foundations in San Francisco, the St. Anthony Foundation. It is a foundation which deals with the homeless in one of the poorest neighborhoods in San Francisco, the Tenderloin neighborhood. And for those of you who are outside the United States, and for those of you who are outside of California, and I imagine since we began at 5 o'clock in the morning in California, there are very few sisters, maybe I'm wrong, from California on this Zoom conference, but this is, I mean, probably one of the poorest areas of San Francisco is an area that has probably more drug dealers than businesses. It is a very difficult and a rough area, but there is one block of the Tenderloin. The Friary is on Golden Gate Avenue. There is one block where it is safe. There's one block where there is people have agreed not to do it, and this is where St. Anthony Foundation is. We work with the homeless, etc. When I go to meetings, I try to get there a day early and either work in the kitchen, work in the area where we give food. I mean, we give clothing to those who need, help out if possible in the clinic, the free clinic, which is there as well. But talk to those who find themselves homeless, young people, old people, women, men, those even with families. And it is only in that, not talking to them, but hearing them stories, that I honestly am in awe. Am in awe for who they are, what they have done. And it is in that conversation that trust begins to occur. My trust of them, interestingly, their trust of me. I only get out there probably about 6 times a year, but there are people who do remember me, and we begin conversations where conversations left off. Silent awareness, the spiritual listening evokes awe, awe of the other, awe of God, and evokes trust. And I tend to think we need trust to move into the next moment of this, the moment of discernment, because we are not going to allow ourselves to be vulnerable to the other unless we can trust the other. So we're going to pause again. Now, this is the major movement out into small groups. I'm going to ask you all to be vulnerable. I'm going to ask all of you to not only talk about the good points of what's going on, but your own difficulties in listening in your communities. And how do I want to put it? The qualities of listening, not necessarily the qualities your people ought to have in listening to you. So what is the quality of listening in your communities? What might need improvement? And if something needs to be improved, now, granted, your communities might be much better than mine. There's a whole lot of improvement we need in my community of Franciscans. But maybe the difficult question is hearing from one another regarding how this might be done. And I'm now going to return this back to Maria and to Gianluca.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the richness of looking at gazing, to think about contemplation as a way of being silently aware of reconnecting ourselves, both to ourselves and to God and to one another. Those are beautiful pieces. And the invitation you've given us as we reflect on this to be willing to be vulnerable. And vulnerable means I can be impacted by the other too. So it means I can allow myself to hear, listen. And so maybe a gift of being in this next part is that you'll be able to listen deeply. And you'll also be invited to share so the others can. This is the question you have before you, however you're going to want to answer it. What's the quality of listening in your experience in communities you're part of? What works? What are some of the impediments? And what could you imagine needing improvement? And how might you do this? So we're going to allow for 3-4 minutes of just silence as you ponder this. And at the same time, this should only take you a few seconds. Gianluca is going to put up on the screen in front of you a language bar that allows you to choose so that we can put you in small groups according to your language. So if you would be so kind to just push English or French, Italian, Spanish, we really ask you to be in a group. If you really cannot, or if you have 5 people on your screen already in your house, and that'll be your group for discussion, that's fine. But we ask everyone, and we can see how many have answered. If you would, and then go back to the question. But just if you would sign, those of you, we'd be grateful. So which is your language, your preferred language? All of those are possible. So we'll it should be in front of you, but it needs you to both click on it and then finish. So click and then finish. And then when you've done that, if you would just use those questions for your reflection so that you come with that having been thought about. is that we can bring everyone back from every room that you were in. I hope you had some good conversations. Were you able to have the kind of sharing that our brother Father Tom was able to invite? Did you find you could have some of that? Um, and so what we invite you now to, are there some comments, questions, reflections, maybe even on what your group said? If you would like, you're welcome to put your hand up. If you just go to the React, and there's a way to raise your hand, and then you can always lower it, or we can help. But would be happy to hear from some voices. And you're also welcome to write in the chat. So, we have 3 already. Wonderful. So, Tolin, please, we'd love to hear you.
Morning, good day, everyone. I loved my breakout group. Bobby in our group said the best of the best. In order for us to communicate effectively, we have to be open to being influenced. That is a successful conversation. How many times do we have a conversation? No one wants to be influenced one way or the other. And that was awesome. Um, all 4 of us were bringing to the table of having the opportunity to implement the St. Clair method, even though I didn't know it was the St. Clair method of gazing. But when you're learning all of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the St. Clair method really encompasses or holds how you can operate in all of those gifts from the Holy Spirit.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. And that there's another word to use, like we could be influenced by the other, and that influence can be a positive word and not overpowered, or the social media influencers that, that it's on a level that's very superficial. It's about what hair shampoo you buy, but here you're talking about something deeper. So thank you for that. Thank you. Sue, would you offer some words here?
Yes, we had some comments about body language, which I don't think I've ever heard brought up in any of our discussions, and maybe it's taken for granted, but just some behavioral body language things we could do by uh, nodding, smiling, just gazing at the person, looking at the person. I thought those were all very helpful because sometimes my problem is I want to interrupt and agree with the person as a way to encourage them, whether I'm being corrected or whether I'm trying to tell the person to relax. You didn't have to do what I asked you to do. But I'm going to use these behavior modifications. And I think it's another aspect to this whole conversation in the spirit. Even if we're not speaking, we can be inviting, whether we agree with the person or disagree with the person. We can still be looking at them, nodding, encouraging them to continue with whatever it is they want to say. So thank you very much. These are very, very helpful sessions.
Here. We have a sister from Equipo General Franciscano. So please, you are unmuted.
Yes, I'm a Franciscan, but I see the enlightenment. I mean, what Father Thomas has shared with us has enlightened us so much when he has talked about the conversation in the spirit, and he has talked about St. Clair. everything he has shared with us, and also the small group in which we could talk to sisters from other countries. Well, all of this has been a gift. I'm together with another sister, and we're really convinced that this is the way of the Spirit. And we don't always put into practice this conversation of the Spirit. I had the grace of taking part in the International Assembly of Superior Generals, the UISG assembly that took place in Rome. And it was such a deep experience. And I have to say that here, the members of the general team are trying to uh, apply this space for God in our conversation. At the same time, we have been working with some sisters for 15 years, working with um, people who suffer from addiction. And we are trying to work on a different way of opening our heart. It's like a very deep charis that spread across the sisters. And like Father Thomas was telling us when he referred to the mission they have in a place with poor people. Well, we ourselves learned that we needed inner silence, so that the other could express themselves and so that they could convey what they had to convey in the midst of so much pain. And this really is a call from the Lord, a call from the Lord who is asking us to share our vulnerabilities. Thank you so much, Father Thomas, and thanks to UISG and to all of you. Peace and good.
Grazie, sorella. Tom, because you were also speaking about people working with people in difficult situations and the kind of listening that's needed. What have you found? Is it the same kind of listening? Sister was saying sometimes we can have people in our communities who are in pain and struggling. What is that call to listening?
One of the issues of that I'd mentioned before regarding vulnerability, sort of the root deals with woundedness. And therefore, I mean, to be vulnerable allows others to share our wounds. So, I mean, in some ways, it's the same, but in other ways, I think we need to listen even more, not only to hear what the person's saying, but to hear the woundedness behind what the person is saying. And oftentimes I have experienced if I am wounded, oftentimes my first reaction is to fight back, is to be very aggressive. And sometimes that aggression will turn another off. I think what we're called to do as ministers and as members of the Franciscan family and as religious for those of us who are not Franciscan is to stay with that person even when it's very uncomfortable for us. So yeah, I mean, I tend to think there's a similarity and a difference. There's another hand up, do you know, Maria?
Yeah,
Sister
we
Kelly?
have a few. So
Oh, okay.
we
Others. Oh,
have
yes, there are more and more. I don't know if we want to
yeah,
continue or
yeah,
just,
no, yes. Ann Kelly, please, and then we'll have Maria Chiara.
who I think is frozen.
Yeah, Sister Ann Kelly. Oops,
There.
I think she's frozen. Right, I'm gonna take her out of that, and we'll get back to her when her internet is a little more stable. But so Maria Chiara, please.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you. As a daughter of St. Clair, it's so nice to hear a father talking to us about Claire. And it's so nice to hear such beautiful words written by Claire accompanying our daily discernment. With the other two sisters who were part of my group, we highlighted the good points and those who might need improvement. And we realized that three are the aspects of listening and discernment, which have to do with body and verbal language. Uh, our fraternal situations were very varied in our group, and so we reflected on how important verbal and non-verbal language is, as well as culture in an intercultural fraternity and the intergenerationality. The different generations in our fraternities are very important. Sometimes we say the same things, but the meanings differ. And so, a need that we all share is the awareness of the common ground that keeps us together to create a discernment on the same topic. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. That's wonderful. They have a little Francis and Claire here. And Tom, I think Sister Maria Chiara is bringing up the point of listening. It has relevance to listening to cultures, genders, generations. Like that's
Precisely. No, beautiful.
that's important
Very good.
ways, and we listen differently. Different generations are going to listen for different things, right? And we have different lenses within us.
And it is so important. For about a dozen years, every other year, I would do some teaching to our friars in Zimbabwe. And it was only when I was in Zimbabwe did I begin understanding the communal element of Franciscanism, because we Americans are so individualistic. We think we are communal. Just one experience, this was in South Africa. It was Christmas, and the friars, all from England and Great Britain, wanted to give the housekeeper something for Christmas. And her answer was, "Oh, yes, thank you. I would like 50 pounds of rice, 50 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of sugar for my village." Fine. But what do you want? 50 pounds of rice, 50 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of flour for my village. We'll get that. But what about you personally? 50 pounds of rice, 50 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of flour for my village. The oftentimes I hear, I am because we are. We Americans do not understand that at all. It only took my living for several times in Africa before I began understanding that and allowing it to affect my life. So exactly right. We need other cultures. We need other generations. And just two things, the body language. The body language is so important because oftentimes I share my real thoughts through my body language, even though my words might be saying something totally different. This was before Maria came to CTU. We had an IT person who every question you would ask would be answered by, you knew that they weren't interested in the questions, and would go through the same motions, but not really answering the question. So body language is important. And before the break, Maria mentioned to me that one of you brought up the question of social media. Social media is a help. I mean, we could not be doing this if it were not social media, but social media also has built-in limitations and dangers. Social media, the joke in my country, the United States, is people at the dinner table communicating to one another with their iPhones, not speaking. As important as it has limited our ability to listen because we don't listen. The emphasis on what we are saying, and in fact, even when many social media, Sister Maria talked about influencers, the focus is always on me. This country, TikTok, the focus is on me. And so it is important to use the media, but always to understand the real good possibilities, but also the limits of the media, which is not a new issue. The issue goes back to the Gutenberg Bible. I mean, every time we have a new medium, new possibilities exist, but it also limits us in different ways. I would like to just sort of wrap things up, and I was going to set up the PowerPoint again, but I don't think I need to.
Tom,
sorry.
we still have about 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. I thought you needed some time at the end.
No, I need about 5 minutes, but we're only at, we have about 10 more minutes, I think. So let me allow, because Sister Ann Kelly is now available. I think we see her. So I'm gonna, I will stop you at one point, but we can do this here because she had her hand up. So Ann, please offer. Sister Ann, are you there? Every time we get there, she freezes. Ann Kelly?
It looks like it's frozen again.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Person who had been present at the Synod of Synodality told us that in just a personal conversation with a certain bishop, this bishop had shared that he had introduced in his diocese that every single meeting at whatever level, diocese, parish, or anywhere else, must start with a short scripture reflection and sharing. And I think this is something that probably took about 10, 15 minutes, a short passage of scripture, a silent time to reflect, and brief sharing from each person present there. And he said that this had transformed his diocese. So I thought that was a message for all of us. If we started our meetings, we have been blessed actually to have been doing it in our congregation at general chapters for quite a long time, actually. And whether it's done in communities depends on the communities. But I think it's a very powerful way that if we start by listening to the word of God, it will lead us into a more listening attitude as we listen to each other. I thought that was a powerful sharing from that particular bishop that we might all take to heart. And of course, it's very Franciscan that we listen to the scriptures, especially the Gospels. That was very much Francis' way. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
Thank you. Thanks all of you for beautiful points of view. I speak about changing my mind, and I tend to think one of you who said being influenced might even be a better way of saying it. Because changing my mind is still focusing on myself. Being influenced by the other is, again, changing the focus of my gaze from myself to the other. So thank you for that. And I will probably in the future change slides to, rather than changing my mind, but to allowing myself to be influenced. Some of you had mentioned this, and I think it's, there are obstacles to our ability to listen. And I think all of you have mentioned about it. It'd be good to anything that takes the focus off the other is an obstacle to my ability to listen. And again, I'm an American, and our individualism oftentimes gets in the way. I'm an extrovert, and my sin is trying to finish everybody else's sentence. And oftentimes when I do that, I finish their sentence in a way that they were not going to finish the sentence. So again, I'm not listening. I'm putting my ideas out rather than hearing and listening and gazing upon the person who is speaking, interrupting others. A couple of you mentioned that even when we try to do it as a help to another, especially from another different culture, it's an act of domination, and it is problematic. If I'm thinking up my answer to the other person while they're speaking, I'm not listening. And oftentimes, again, we Westerners tend to do that. We're spending so much time on how we're going to respond that we don't listen to what the other person's saying. Anything that takes my focus off the other is an obstacle to true listening. And so if we move back to the very beginning of this conversation we've been having 2.5 hours ago, I suggested that there's a Franciscan tweak on see, judge, act. Not that that's wrong, and not that somehow we have something better, but our perspective may add something, and as I suggested, may also detract from some good parts of the see, judge, act. But listen, discern, go forth. With the emphasis on listening, I think allows the other to be the focus. And, we talked about a big D and a small d discernment. There's a big O and a small O other. As I tend to listen to others with small O's, I'm listening to God, who is the other, with the big O. As we move tomorrow into the other two movements, discerning and going forth, listen, we don't forget about listening. Listening has to be part of discerning. Listening has to be part of going forth. Prayerful listening has to be part of discernment, which is what the conversation of the Spirit is about. Prayerful listening has to move us forth. And so it's not that somehow these are neat, distinct, discrete moments that have nothing to do with each other. Each builds upon the previous one. So it's not that we're not going to listen tomorrow, but we'll see how listening moves us into discernment, how discernment moves us into going forth. And with that, it's about 7 minutes, and I'm now going to give it back to you, Maria.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. I am so grateful. We're really blessed to have Father Tom with us. I'm sure you feel that way. And this is just part one. This is like getting half of the way forward. And so there's part 2 and 3 tomorrow. And so we beg you to come back. And so we will do the same thing tomorrow, except we'll have further ways to listen and engage and discern. So this is a whole part of a whole series. So this is 2 parts, and I'm grateful. I want to give a few more thanks to this and also tell you it's part of a 4-part series. And just so you can mark your calendars too, in November 4th and 5th, we will have the Dominican family teach us about this communal discernment through the Dominican lens. So, I know Francis and Dominic were great friends and sometimes rivals, but this is the gift of our church of this. So, but we're starting with the Franciscan family, and it is just as we're about to get to a very important set of days and feasts. And Father Tom will speak to that tomorrow a little bit more too. I want to thank, we speak about social media, but none of this could happen if we did not have people who know technology, including all of you who are able to push your buttons, who are able to get online in all those ways. The same Zoom link for tomorrow. Everything is the same Zoom link we will have you on. But I want to thank particularly our interpreters, Pascal, Sylvina, Sylvia. The reason podemos hablar en español y merci en francés y, grazie mille in Italian, and we can hear each other, is because we have gifted friends here who've been with us a long time, and so know our ebbs and flows and know some of you. So I hope the interpreters see all the hearts going up and all the thanks. So I thank you for that. Gianluca is just always adaptable, trying to read. We're always trying to read what you're saying, and if you need something, and putting us into groups and finding those things out. And and he's the one I go to for all my technology. And he's a great person in addition to all those things. So I just want to let you know. And this is part of the whole series. And I have to say, in listening to this, listening with my heart, influenced by, in many ways, the Franciscan spirit as well, there's so much in what's been said that would also find itself in our synod and in what has gone on. And so many of you talked about also silence and listening, as did Tom. One of the gifts in the synod was when we did conversation in the spirit, and thank you so many who've talked about it or said you use this. When each person speaks, if you have a table of 12, which is what we had at the synod, one person speaks for 4 minutes each round and listens for 40. So you're always doing so much more listening. The other thing we did was always have silence after someone spoke. So we literally could have a half a minute to a minute when that first round went, so that we could soak it in, so that it would be like gentle rain on a parched soil, to use a scriptural image, or like a tea bag and needs to be in the water to really get the flavor. Or when you chew on something, instead of just swallowing it, you get the flavors. And so there was a lot of silence in what we did. And I just invite all of you to think about, at your meetings, at your community meetings or faculty meetings, after a few people speak, have some silence. Watch the shift that starts happening. After someone presents, have some silence. If you have a panel, have silence between each one. Then people can jot, can write. There's a lot that's possible. So just want to invite you to that. It will shift how we do community life. And community life also says, when we are finished, we are finished. And so we just want to say thank you to you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, thank you. And we're going to unmute, and people can say hello, speak as you wish. So gracias, merci beaucoup, grazie mille, hvala lepa,
Thank you, Father
you.
Thomas. Thank you, Father Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gracias.